let me start by introducing Tony Atkinson, who needs absolutely no introduction in this university because he's been head of Nuffield for some years, but he has an immensely distinguished career. We all know his formula for measuring inequality, and we've all grown up with the Atkinson measure, and so quite apart from that, he's made huge, and what I really admire him for is that he is immensely powerful theoretically, but he also gets down to the nitty-gritty of measuring poverty among children in Europe, in the UK, and policies, and the whole range of things. He doesn't just stick with his theory, which he could easily do. And so he has had a very distinguished career. He's been a professor of economics at Essex University, a professor of economics at Cambridge University. He's been on a variety of commissions, and he's written a large number of books, most of which seem to have inequality in the title, but there may be some which don't have inequality in the title. So let me turn to you first, and then I'll introduce Francois. And you have up to half an hour.
Thank you very much, Francis. I have written a book about footpaths, I should say. Quite a short book about footpaths. Well, I think we all come to the launching of this very interesting initiative from different directions. The particular direction to which I've come to it, I think, is from a concern about the current state of welfare economics, a concern I'm sure shared by many people in this room, and in particular the fact that welfare economics is no longer central to economics. When I was a student, I read several books on the subject of welfare economics. I went to several courses on it. It was regarded as being really an essential part of the education of an economist. But studying how we make welfare judgments is not, I think now, with some possible exceptions, in the mainstream of teaching and research. Yet economics is full of welfare judgments. In my mail yesterday, I received a bulletin from the ZEW in Mannheim, which includes an article that tells us, for example, that the optimum public spending ratio is between 30 and 35% of GDP. When I mentioned it to Francois, he said, oh, at least it wasn't zero. Which I think probably reflects the fact that he's a policymaker at the moment, whereas I, being an academic, theoretical ivory tower economist, worried about what the foundations were for making that kind of statement. And as Amartya Sen reminded us yesterday, those foundations are effectively those which were used by Pigou, with whom I was momentarily classified yesterday in his lecture, to my surprise. But it was basically an approach of a social welfare function whose arguments are the individual welfares. It is a welfarist approach to evaluation. And, as Amartya has argued very powerfully, that leaves no place for many of the things we've been talking about this morning. Leaves no place for mortality, life expectancy, hunger. It leaves no place, effectively, for a multidimensional approach. Now, the chair's already identified that I have been somewhat delinquent. I did say to Sabina when she asked me to talk that I wouldn't. I would like to talk about what I'm currently working on. And that is the reason for the title. Rather than perhaps go over things I've worked on in the past, specifically about multidisciplinary welfare economics, although I hope you'll see towards the end that there clearly is a relevance. What I want to talk about is thinking about these issues, taking individual giving for development as a case study. I do this for three reasons. The first, most pragmatic reason is that I'm currently employed on an ESRC project to work on this subject. And so if anyone's here from the National Audit Office, I want you to go back and report that I am indeed your official money is being well spent. Or at least it's being spent. The second reason is I think that individual giving to development is an element of financing programs to combat world poverty and to try and enhance human development. An aspect which has probably been rather neglected, but which is getting increasing attention because of things like the big donations from the Gates Foundation and Warren Buffett, and from the fact that individuals in many rich countries are increasingly, not perhaps on a very large scale, and the average in the UK is about £25 a year, is being given to overseas development. And I think this raises a number of interesting issues, not least the fact this is one of the few occasions on which people directly reveal information about how they think about the objectives of development. And then the reason at the top of my list is that I think it's a way of trying to raise issues about welfare economics. Now, Amartya has engaged what I would call a full frontal attack on welfare economics. I'm trying to, in this paper, take a kind of flanking manoeuvre, go round, and somehow insert myself inside welfare economics, and then try and raise some of the difficulties that we get from looking at this issue. So that is what I'm going to try and do, and the contents are summarised on this slide. Now, my starting point is, as I said, with mainstream welfare economics and how it has treated issues of redistribution between individuals, which has standardly been incorporated through utility interdependence. This is something which is usually traced back to a series of interesting contributions in 1969 by Serge Kolm, Hoffman and Rogers and others, but actually, in fact, goes much further, and it seems appropriate in Oxford today to cite from Edgeworth's Mathematical Psychics, a passage which, as you can see from reading it, is rather colourfully phrased, but expresses very clearly, right in the early days of utilitarian formulations, the concerns that legitimately can be incorporated between, as he calls it, the frozen pole of egoism and the tropical expanse. I assume tropical expanses are supposed to be a good thing, I think, from his point of view, of utilitarianism. But the basic idea is that individuals themselves have objectives, which I've written with a capital U, and that's the objective of person I, which include their own individual welfare, which is a small ui, and then a concern, here seems to be symmetric, treating everyone the same, a concern with their neighbours. Incidentally, this is the same formulation that Amartya used in a paper he wrote about the allocation of labour in a cooperative enterprise in the 1960s. And the key question that I want to work towards is, given individuals have concerns of this kind, what are the implications of that for the form of our social judgment, the social welfare function? Now that, of course, involves a lot of different concerns. I only have 30 minutes, so I'm going to put on one side the issue of what I regard as the equity issues between people, at least between the people in whose social welfare function I'm forming. So for the moment, I guess I'm going to talk, perhaps in this sense it's a good thing that perhaps Amartya is not here, because I'm going to talk about the sum of the individual welfares, the sum of the utilities. But of course, the key question which you can immediately see from this formulation is, should this be the sum of the individual's own particular welfares, the small ui, or should it be the sum of the big ui, including their views about the wider objectives of society? Now, in some sense, it may not matter. And in fact, as I note at the bottom, and as Amartya in fact pointed out in his paper I just referred to, if everyone is equally symmetric about, equally concerned about others, then in fact you get the same answer. The sums come out to be the same, because in fact everyone cares for everyone else, and therefore you simply get a multiple of the sum of individual welfare. So in that case it doesn't matter. But this is where I want to turn to the particular case, This is a case which doesn't, I think, apply very well to the issue of giving for development. That is, maybe fine thinking about a society of people who are broadly in the same situation, but the notion of giving for development clearly involves an asymmetry. And I think it's fair to say that if people are giving money to Oxfam, giving money to Save the Children, giving money to the Gates Foundation, they're doing so because of an asymmetry in their relationship, and they're doing, what we can infer from that is that they're certainly concerned about the disadvantaged, the potential recipients, but may not be very concerned with the rest of the population. That is, it may not be symmetric. And what I want to go on and say now is, assuming that people in fact do have this kind of asymmetric concern. That is, giving for development is concerned with people who are less well off than ourselves in an important way. We may also be concerned about the welfare of Bill Gates. But this is effectively leaving him out of my individual utility function because I'm focusing on the disadvantaged. That is, the objectives of giving for development are more circumscribed. Now, we could go even further and say that actually the giving for development is not really concerned with individual recipients at all. And this is the way it's been treated in part of the literature on philanthropy. And part of the literature on philanthropy supposes that actually people derive a benefit from the act of giving. They derive what's usually referred to in the literature as a warm glow from the act of making a gift. They like to feel that they contributed to Oxfam, they like to feel they contributed to disaster relief. It isn't an outcome-orientated feeling, it is in fact an input, as it were, which is their value. Now, this warm glow interpretation is quite popular in the literature, and it may explain something about people's general disposition, perhaps, to make charitable gifts. But I don't think it's a very satisfactory treatment of this particular form of giving for overseas development. That is, we're trying to explain why people give to this rather than to say give it to animals or give it to the elderly. Then I think we have to ask ourselves, people are doing this because actually there is an outcome element in the concern. And the other main way in which this has been treated in the literature then is to say, well, there is an outcome, or we're concerned with the outcomes, and this outcome is a kind of public good. That is, we're concerned with the development of Africa, and that's what we're trying to achieve, and clearly that was a result of the contributions being made by individuals, by governments, by many people, and of course from the resources from the countries themselves. And this brings me to a second feature of giving for development. It is different from, say, supporting your local hospice or your local school. It is a question of large numbers. It's literally a question of millions, if not billion. So I think we have then to confront the problem with the public good interpretation, which is, in that case, as the number of potential recipients gets large, you run into the evident free-riding problem. And effectively, the models of philanthropy which treat it as a public good show that as the scale of the problem increases, the individual contributions go to zero, everyone effectively seeks to free ride. And to quote Andreoli, who's recently surveyed this literature on philanthropy, he said that as the number of people rises, we're driven back to warm glow as being effectively the only explanation of individual giving. There seems to be neither of these are actually very satisfactory then from the point of view of giving for development. So what I want to suggest is we actually should think about it in a different way. And the framing of the problem I want to suggest, which then has implications for the social judgments we make, is that donors are concerned with the impact on living standards of the recipients. They are concerned with the outcomes. It's not simply enough to put a cheque in the post to Oxfam or to send your credit card number to Live 8.